Okay, good. So, welcome to this ninth class of the Minds and Mental Factors. We're going to start with the prayers we usually do on page 73 of the prayer book, which is the praise to Shakyamuni Buddha that we'll do 3 times in English. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. Now we'll do the short mandala offering, which again is either on 97 or 98 of your prayer book, depending on which version of the prayer book you have. Excuse me. And we'll do that in English and then skip down to the offering mantra on the middle of page 98, and then continue with refuge and bodhicitta once in English, twice in Tibetan. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. I go for refuge until I am enlightened, to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la changchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chunyen gi peso nam gi dola penchir sangye drupar shok sangye chodang soki choknam la Jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chunyen gi peso namgi drola penchir sangye drupar shog. Okay, let's go ahead and do a short meditation then to focus our minds a bit and then generate good motivation for being here. So as usual, excuse me, we'll just do a few minutes of focused meditation on the breath. And you can use whatever technique suits your mind to work with the breath. I'll ring the chime to start that period, and then after a few minutes, I'll lead you in a short reflection on bodhicitta. So now let's set our motivation for being here. And as you know, we've been learning a lot about the mind in this course. And this is because mind is really central to Buddhism. It is the workshop in which we apply the Buddha's teachings, especially through developing our own understanding by engaging in the teachings, then putting them into practice. All of this is rooted in perhaps the most eloquent teaching that the Buddha gave, the most succinct teaching, which is the Four Noble Truths. So we're going to reflect on the Four Noble Truths briefly as a way of generating our motivation. And we begin by thinking about this in terms of ourselves, and then we'll extend it out to others. But essentially, the Buddha in this teaching was telling us what our situation is currently. In the first two truths, explaining very clearly that we are suffering, that we are in this state of dukkha, an unsatisfactory existence, that even what we think is pleasure in this life is really in the nature of dukkha. We are pretty much suffering around the clock because we're never really free of the factors that cause us suffering, always prone to suffering. And this leads us into the second noble truth, that the causes of our suffering are within our own minds. The root of ignorance, the other delusions that arise on the basis of that, the actions, the contaminated karma we create. These are the causal factors that lead us into this state of samsara, conditioned existence. So in the first two truths, the Buddha is being a very skillful doctor and telling us that we actually are quite ill, but that there are causes of our illness that he has identified. In the last two truths, the Buddha, continuing to be the most skillful doctor, tells us that we can attain a state of perfect health. This is the third noble truth, the truth of the cessation of suffering and its causes. That this is attainable for each and every one of us. But to think in particular about yourself right now, that you can attain a state where you have removed all your own suffering, all the dukkha, the state of nirvana, complete pacification of all the afflictions, all the delusions. And to do that, we have to take the medicine. Doctor knows that without applying the antidote to our situation, without removing the causes of our illness, we can never attain that state of perfect health. So the medicine is the true path, the fourth noble truth, which essentially boils down to generating a practice of good morality, cultivating very deep concentration, and on the basis of that, developing the wisdom that will cut the roots of our suffering, that will undermine the ignorance that is behind all of our delusions and at the root of our contaminated karma and the suffering that arises from that. So we should be extremely joyful that we have found this path. We have found this way to attain a complete end to our own existence in samsara. But this is the predicament that every single sentient being is in as well. And every single sentient being has the same potential that we do to know the taste of freedom from suffering, nirvana. Moreover, ourselves and all sentient beings can even go beyond that to attain the perfection of our being in the state of Buddhahood. And if we ourselves were to attain that state, we could then skillfully guide every single being, help them to know their minds, to practice the path, to develop morality, concentration, wisdom, to undermine their own causes of suffering, and moreover attain the state of Buddhahood. So informed by the Four Noble Truths in terms of our own situation, but also seeing the universality of this, that every single being is caught up in this same process, we generate that motivation, wishing to become enlightened for their sake, to engage in this study of the mind, so that we can benefit beings to that greatest degree. And think that it's for this reason that you're here tonight. Okay. So we are working our way through the mental factors. We're in the second grouping. There are 6 groups of mental factors that this text has delineated. The first grouping were the omnipresent, ever-present ones, which are there all the time. And then the second group are these ones that we call object determining or object ascertaining. It should be coming on. Yeah, it's on. So good, we have the slide up here. So I won't be sharing the slides quite yet. Well, actually, maybe, yeah, let's go to the text first. Last time that we were here, we went through the first few of the object ascertaining. Again, these are called object ascertaining because they're present when the mind is focusing on a particular object, kind of getting to know that object. So these are, again, all in the realm of our mental consciousness. These are not something that are present in our sense consciousnesses, but rather are there because they are ways that the mind is being directed in terms of a more conceptuality. So we have aspiration that we went through, and then what we call belief or appreciation. And then we started our discussion of mindfulness, which Geshe Rabtin's translation calls recollection. So mindfulness, again, is a very key word in Buddhism, has a lot of um, uh, kind of, again, a lot of different applications of mindfulness. What we're talking about in terms of this particular mental factor is this idea of non-forgetfulness. This is the part of the mind that holds the object that we are focusing on. So we'll go to the bottom of page 27 just to review really quickly. Regarding the entity of mindfulness, the Compendium of Knowledge, Asanga's text says, what is mindfulness? Top of 28. It is a non-forgetfulness of the mind. Of course, it has to be with respect to a familiar object because we can't be mindful and recollecting something that we don't know yet, something that we haven't become familiar with. And it also has the function of non-distraction, not allowing distraction to occur. So while we are holding the object, there is no distraction. If we lose our mindfulness, then it's due to distraction when we have the presence of distraction. So these 3 kind of features of the definition were pointed out then next in the text. The objective feature, meaning it has to be a familiar object. The subjective aspect feature, which is this non-forgetfulness upon having observed that object. And then the functional feature, that it keeps us from being distracted. Its function is non-distraction. So I won't go through again the little explanation of each of those. I think we're pretty familiar with that. What I was going through, and we will go ahead and go to the slide now, do the share screen on this for those who are, let me see, I think that this will be the one that works. Yeah, that should work. I think everyone has that now. So again, these 5 object ascertaining mental factors, don't need to go through. We'll be going through hopefully both meditative stabilization and mindfulness. This is the way Geshe Rabtin described mindfulness. It's a distinct factor, mental factor, that repeatedly brings to mind a phenomenon of previous acquaintance without forgetting it, has the function of not allowing the mind to be distracted from its objects. And of course, it's the basis for concentration. When our mindfulness is there, our non-forgetfulness, then we're staying with the object, and then concentration can develop. Let's go on then to, these again are slides I went through last time just to refresh our memory. Recollection operates within a wide variety of activities. During single-pointed meditation, it is the factor responsible for constantly bringing the object to mind and holding it there. So again, we're talking about mindfulness having this particular function. As I mentioned last time, there is a connotation to mindfulness in some traditions that it's a sort of unconditional presence with whatever's going on. And there's that quality to it, but we're talking about a real function that it's serving to keep us with the object. It's not allowing us to be distracted. The next one in the practice, this was all these different applications. And so I went through a few of these, and I'm just going to go through all of them again today. In the practice of moral discipline, for example, this is one way that we apply our mindfulness. It is compared to the watchman at the doorway of the mind, who has the task of being constantly mindful of the various mental factors, in particular, the afflictions that arise. So when the afflictions arise, of course, is when our moral discipline is at stake, when we won't actually do what we're intending to do. So we need to have that in our practice of morality, this factor of mindfulness. Through recollection of one's vows and commitments, unwholesome mental factors are unable to gain a foothold in the mind, thus causing turmoil and chaos. So if you are maintaining your mindfulness, then it will allow you to uphold your vows, to not allow the contrary behavior to occur. The next one, while studying, I don't think I went through this one. While studying, recollection enables one to remember what one has learned previously, and thus allows a store of knowledge to be built up. If we weren't able to kind of hold on to objects and recollect them and be mindful of them, then we wouldn't be able to build up our knowledge, our store of the Buddha's teachings that help us to actually advance on our path. I think that one of the things that we don't realize frequently is how much we actually have learned. We sometimes beat ourselves up that perhaps we feel a bit still, I don't know, ignorant of everything and not maybe, practicing to the degree we'd like, but we actually have an incredible store of knowledge, and every one of you in the room has already built up, that treasury of the Dharma, if you will. So it's good to acknowledge that and to remember that recollection or mindfulness is really key in being able to do that. In everyday life, even, it gives order to one's daily activities through enabling one to remember what has to be done at particular times and so forth. I mean, I don't think you could drive a car without mindfulness, knowing kind of your familiarity. And this is why when we're in an unfamiliar environment, the mindfulness isn't as present, right? Because we talked about it needing to be around a familiar object. But if you're on, your regular route and everything, you can kind of stay attentive to where you're going, what you're doing because of mindfulness. And then this summary in brief: recollection or mindfulness is compared to a treasure house that can store many wholesome qualities without letting them perish. So this is a very important factor, again, in our practice. Okay, let's hold on to that. Let's go back to the text. All right, so on the middle of page 28, it says there in the text, the mode in which mindfulness possesses the three features is very important in both the context of sutra and tantra. Again, mindfulness is equally important in both of those bodies of teachings and practice. The protector Nagarjuna says in his letter to a friend, this is stanza 54. Why don't we read this together? Some of these verses are nice to read together. O Lord, the Sugata taught that mindfulness of the body is the sole path to be traversed. Pay attention and guard it. Due to mindfulness degenerating, all qualities will be destroyed. So this refers to mindfulness of the body. This is actually the first of what are frequently called the four mindfulnesses: the mindfulness of the body, of feelings, of the mind, and of phenomena. So the four close placements of mindfulness, these we discussed when we went through chapter 4 of the ornament here. These are a practice that are not just exclusive to the Theravadan tradition, though they are frequently talked about in that tradition, much more so than in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. But they're definitely included in our bodhisattva training as well. And each of them have a particular object that they are observing then, the first one being the body. So we need to pay attention to our physicality. And of course, the main one is paying attention to the breath, but we also have to be aware of what our bodies are doing, and even the speech we engage in is a part of our bodies, if you will. Feelings, mind, and phenomena are the other things that are categories of mindfulness. I'm not going to go into all of that and explain all of that, but nonetheless, mindfulness in that context is being able to have this awareness, to be attentive to and hold on to whatever it is that we are observing. So each of them are a sort of doorway, they say, these four close placements of mindfulness, to understanding the Buddha's teachings at a deeper level. The first one, for example, I won't go into all of them, but the mindfulness of the body is said to be a doorway through which we understand the first noble truth of true sufferings. Because once we begin to really pay attention to the qualities of the body, we begin to see the suffering nature of these physical aggregates that we possess. So it's a pathway to helping to realize renunciation and so on. So Nagarjuna is just giving us this caution to, pay attention to mindfulness, needing to have that, to not let it degenerate. Otherwise, our qualities will be destroyed. Otherwise, we will lose all of our progress that we make. Then there's some verses from chapter 5, which again is the chapter on guarding alertness or vigilance in Shantideva's text. Let's read all of these verses and then I'll just talk about them briefly. Even though learned, faithful, and diligent in effort, many become tainted by downfalls due to committing the fault of lacking introspection. Though they have amassed merit, it is pilfered by the thief of non-introspection, who follows upon degeneration of mindfulness. They proceed to a bad migration. This band of thieves, the afflictions, looks for an opportunity. Upon finding an opportunity, it pilfers my virtue and even destroys the life of a good migration. Therefore, mindfulness should never be displaced from the door of the mind. If it does go, recalling the anguish of bad migrations, place it back. Due to association with spiritual teachers, the teachings of the abbot, and fear, fortunate ones who act respectfully easily generate mindfulness. So again, this isn't a commentary on Shantideva's text, so I won't go into great detail on these. But in this chapter in particular, I mentioned this last week, we have these two factors, and introspection isn't one of the list of 51. Again, one teacher, I can't remember who this was, that said that it's included in wisdom, one of the other omnipresent mental factors. But it's that spy in the corner of the mind, if you will, that sort of checks in to see what the quality of our mindfulness is. Are we still with the object? Are we still paying attention? Are we still being vigilant or committed to the object, holding the object, and so on? And if we aren't, then we make a correction, we make an adjustment. If something has crept into the mind that has distracted us, that has taken us elsewhere, or caused us to lose that mindfulness, then we restore our mindfulness at that point. I mentioned last week that these two are compared to a rope and a goad. You know, the rope of mindfulness that holds the elephant in place, and then when the elephant tries to get away, then the goad that pulls the mind back, you know, or alerts the mind to that fact. So again, these two work in tandem, and as Bob pointed out last week, frequently the language we use gets a little confusing about which one is which. But essentially, the mindfulness is present when we are not distracted, when we aren't away from the object. And this is why we need to have good mindfulness, is so that we stay present, particularly with what we're trying to practice. If we're meditating, then of course we have to stay together with the object that we're meditating upon, whatever that might be, whether it be single pointed meditation or whether it be analytical meditation, where we're meditating on trying to develop deeper compassion or a deeper understanding of the Four Noble Truths, whatever the case might be. So mindfulness needs to be present whenever we are engaging in any of that type of practice, but it also needs to be present throughout our day, so that we don't lose our awareness of what was mentioned earlier, our vows and commitments, our morality, discipline, and what have you. So again, Shantideva is just essentially saying that the person who maintains good mindfulness is going to see this accumulation of merit, accumulation of positive qualities. And if we aren't maintaining it, we need to have our own sort of antidote to it, which is to recall where our lack of mindfulness is going to lead us. That if we aren't mindful of our behavior at the first level, which is again conduct or moral discipline, is the foundation of all of our practice. So if we aren't attentive and holding on to our awareness at that time, we're going to engage in unskillful behavior. We're going to end up, you know, using this life simply to create the causes for bad migrations as opposed to good ones, and furthermore for liberation and enlightenment. So just recalling that, and again, that's the whole teaching on like bad migrations is part of the small scope, the very first level of the Lam Rim, because that's the first level of kind of, we need to take heed of that, make sure that we're not, that we're at least avoiding bad migrations. Yeah, Bob. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm. Right. Mm. Well, Bob's comment was in the second verse where it says that it is pilfered by the thief of non-introspection who follows upon degeneration of mindfulness, and saying that he was making the statement that it's interesting to say that the non-introspection follows from losing your mindfulness, and it would seem that you need the introspection present only when you do have some mindfulness. Well, I would say yes, and to the degree that what introspection is trying to do, though, is to see if you have lost your mindfulness because some other factor has come in. But you have to have some mindfulness to start with, I suppose, is true. Otherwise, introspection doesn't really know what it's checking for. It doesn't really know what, it doesn't play a role, or it's not arising because we're not even checking in. But it is true that to the degree that we keep losing our mindfulness, frequently the non-introspection is also there. Then we aren't even vigilant enough to know that we're not doing what we're supposed to be doing. Because again, mindfulness is the not forgetting. Remember when I put up the 5 faults and the 8 antidotes? Forgetting the instruction is essentially the second fault that we have, right? The first one being laziness. Forgetting the instruction means forgetting the object, losing the object. So we have to kind of acknowledge that if we don't have the awareness to kind of stay with the object, to not forget the object, then frequently the introspection isn't going to arise necessarily either, because it's based on the idea that we want to not forget the object. They work in tandem. They both have the same goal, which is to keep us on the object. Mindfulness is what actually holds us there. Introspection is what sees when it's not there. So I'd say in that way, yes. But the whole purpose of introspection is to find the times when our mindfulness has been lost. But nonetheless, we do have to have some strength of mindfulness, even to have strength of introspection, I think. They do go kind of in tandem and are built upon each other. Of course, at some point, you will have that mindfulness as you develop deeper levels of concentration. You will have the mindfulness being present without the need for introspection. You can leave that behind because you don't have to check any longer. Remember that the final fault was excuse me, over application, where we are applying antidotes without the need to. And that's because introspection still kind of keeps thinking that there's something going on that it needs to pay attention to, but it doesn't. Their mindfulness is there. So you don't need to have any application of antidotes. You don't need to even be checking in because your awareness of the object is pretty strong already. So, yeah. Okay, so let's continue on. I don't know that I need to again talk about every one of these verses. There are many commentaries out there about Master Shantideva's text, so I would encourage you to take a look at those. I'll continue on the middle of page 29. Just after the verses, it says, "The increase of all the excellent qualities of the paths and grounds are contingent upon the two, mindfulness and introspection, and all accomplishments of meditative stabilization of sutra and tantra are necessarily achieved through this special mindfulness." So this is pretty much saying what Master Shantideva was telling us in those verses. Paths and grounds, just so you know this term, this is a frequent term. There is actually even a study of this called salam. Sa is ground, and lam is path, as you know, like lam rim. Salam is essentially this way of talking about how we progress through our levels of accomplishment. So we can talk about the Lam Rim as detailing out the path in terms of the various realizations and topics that you want to develop an awareness of as you proceed to enlightenment. But then we can also talk about the individual's progress in terms of like if we were to do this for school, for example, we could say that there are topics and knowledge that you gain at various levels throughout your schooling. But then there are also the demarcations of when you go from grade school to high school, when you go from high school to university, and so on. So the idea here is that when we look at paths and grounds, we're looking at that delineation of how do you go from one level to the next? What is it that demarcates the path of accumulation, then the path of preparation, the path of seeing, the path of meditation, the path of no more learning, and so on. And grounds are referring specifically to the 10 grounds or bhumis of a bodhisattva that begin with the path of seeing and go through the path of meditation. So again, this is just a terminology that I want to make sure people know, because you might think, well, what do grounds have to do with it? Coffee grounds or anyway. So um, then continuing on, it says, therefore, this very method of relying on mindfulness is of utmost importance for those who, from their heart, wish to practice. In this vein, Master Shantideva also says in the verses that actually preceded what we just recited, let's read these two together. Let my gain and honor, my body and livelihood vanish. Let even my other virtues degenerate, but may my mind never degenerate. I urge you, those who wish to guard their minds, guard your mindfulness and introspection, even at the cost of your lives. So essentially, it's just saying, it's not it's not to discount the importance of the other factors in our minds or the other things we're trying to do, but to essentially say, if you keep this one, if you really keep your mindfulness and your introspection, those two in particular that work in tandem, but your mindfulness being the most important of the two, then you will be guaranteed that you're going to continue to be paying attention to your mind, being aware of what's going on in your mind. Whereas if we lose some of the others, it won't be maybe quite as severe, quite as harsh. But if we lose that, then we're going to be in trouble. So we guard that at the cost of our lives. So this was just, Yeshe Geltzen's way of highlighting the importance of mindfulness, recollection. Let's go to the slides where I just have a few more things to share in regard to what Geshe Rabten had in his book, Mind and Its Functions. So this was the last slide we looked at. Let's go on to the next one. And this wasn't in our text, but I found it interesting. He says there is basically a twofold classification of recollection, mindfulness, into those recollections and memories that disturb the mind and those that do not. Mentally undisturbing recollections. So he said, okay, you got those being mindful of things that disturb the mind. This is again, recalling that all five of these that we call the object ascertaining are not by their nature virtuous. We're talking about them frequently in regard to our practice, because that's the whole point of studying these, is so we apply them to our practice and our virtuous use of them. But we can become very mindful of very unwholesome thoughts. And those are what disturb the mind, what actually cause us to be agitated. When you're cogitating, ruminating over something that happened that you really resent and some anger towards somebody, that's a form of mindfulness you have, right? You're maintaining your mindfulness of the awfulness of that person and what they said and your hurt from that and your anger about it or whatever. All of that is, your mindfulness is equally present there, maybe even more present than what it is in our meditation. And so it's not to say that, mindfulness by itself is some great virtuous quality. As Venerable Rabina pointed out, I think she got it from Lama Zopa, she mentioned it the last time she was here, even good thieves need mindfulness, right? You need to be very attentive to what you're doing and hold your awareness so that you're not triggering the alarm or doing whatever, would cause you to not succeed in your what you're stealing or whatever. So it says here then, the mentally undisturbing recollections, those that don't disturb the mind, can further be divided into those that are still hindered by what we hear the term that they use, mental sinking. We used the term laxity last week when we talked about it, and excitement, that was the same term that we used, and those that are not so hindered. So we could say that there's a mindfulness where you still have the hindrance of those two. Again, we're calling it, those two are the factors that sort of draw the mind inward in a progression of dullness, and could even go as deep as sleep. But laxity is a subtler version of that, if you will, but it's a dulling of the mind, a drawing in of the mind, whereas excitement is drawing out, is where the mind becomes drawn to particularly objects of attachment. So the first type, where we're talking about those that are still hindered, includes all forms of recollection in the mind of one who has not yet attained the 9th level of mental quiescence or calm abiding. Remember, I talked about the 9 levels of mental abiding. Many of you have studied this in the Lam Rim. So when you get to the 9th level, you are free of all of those, both the subtler as well as the coarser forms of laxity and excitement. So you would then have a mindfulness or recollection that is at that level, or prior to that, you would have a mindfulness that is still disturbed by those to some degree. After that, you would have something that is free of those, that is free of that disturbing state. So that includes all recollections associated with the 9th level of mental quiescence, as well as those associated with both mental quiescence itself, the fully qualified state of calm abiding that follows from that 9th level, and what they call here penetrative insight. We frequently call it special insight. This is Vipassana in Sanskrit, Laktung in Tibetan. This is, again, the other main topic that Lama Tsongkhapa in the Lamrim Chenmo, as well as many of the other Lamrim texts, spends a lot of time explaining is what is special insights, particularly the wisdom realizing selflessness or emptiness that is united with the calm abiding, the mental quiescence that then allows you to know emptiness at a much deeper level, first conceptually and then eventually non-conceptually. So this is just saying we can divide our mindfulness into the mindfulness that still could have some disturbance from laxity and excitement, or the mindfulness that will never be disturbed by that because it's attained that level of proficiency. As I mentioned earlier, once you get to that state, then you don't have to worry about introspection by any means, because there's no need for introspection to be checking, because your mindfulness is not going to be disturbed. So any questions on that or on mindfulness? Let's stop the share screen. We're going to go on to meditative stabilization, but I want to go to the text first. So again, if anyone online right now has questions, just type those in and I'll hopefully notice them in the chat box and address those. Let's go ahead then to meditative stabilization, or Tingezin. It's also called samadhi in Sanskrit. You might know this word, samadhi. And there's a bit of a misnomer to some degree, according to what Venerable George Chernoff says. Again, this is being presented in the light of our practice. So that's why the word meditative is used here. Some texts simply abbreviate this to stabilization or concentration. They don't talk about it requiring meditation. And so it's not something that we have to think, oh, well, this is only going to be there when I've developed some deep level of meditative quality to my mind, either through my meditation I'm doing on the cushion or when that carries over into my life off the cushion. But the idea is that it's focused on the aspects of meditation, because that is where we are really trying to cultivate it, is in our meditative practice. So samadhi is referring to any time that we are single-pointedly focused on an object, which we do all have in our everyday life. Once more, I don't think you could drive a car and do all the things that you do if you didn't have some measure of being able to be focused on one thing at a time and have that some continuity to that again. So the whole point is really that this is called a one-pointedness of the mind, but it is not something that we're completely foreign to, though it's obviously something that we can become more attentive to and develop to deeper levels. So we have a question and answer once more from Asanga's text that we start with. What is meditative stabilization or concentration? It is a one-pointedness or single-pointedness of the mind with respect to an imputed thing. It has the function of acting as a support for knowledge, for wisdom, for intelligence. So this idea I mentioned last week, I think, that we talk about this because I was pointing out how these 5 that we're calling object ascertaining are all involved in our conceptual awareness. They're not part of our sensory consciousnesses, because our sensory consciousnesses are simply bringing in that raw data. They are not engaged in objects in these ways, determining objects in these ways. So this is an imputed object. Now, you might have the question, well, what is it when I'm focusing on something that is not an imputed object? By imputed object, we mean something that is developed by our conceptual awareness. So if I ask you to think about an image of the Buddha, again, this is frequently used as an object of meditation in this tradition. So you would think about maybe about 3 feet in front of you, about a meter, a yard in front of you, at the level of your, maybe slightly higher than your eyes, you would visualize a small Buddha, maybe about the size of your thumb. So to think of that and create that is an imputed thing. It's an imputed object. It can be based on something you see, looking at a tanka, looking at a statue, and taking that information in through your visual consciousness, but it is something that is formulated or imputed by your mind. This is because concentration can really only be developed by the mental consciousness. It's really within the domain of our conceptual mind event initially, and then once it gets highly developed and we are able to have the union of calm abiding and special insight, we can eventually have non-conceptual awareness of objects through meditative stabilization. But the beginning place is to use imputed objects. So we can't say, and this is going to come up a little bit later, I even have some slides on this, we can't say that it is exclusively imputed objects, because once our meditative stabilization is there, it will act as a support for our yogic direct perception. Remember, that was something we talked about. It was in part one of this course that we didn't cover prior to this, but the idea is that I did touch on that previously. That is one form of mental consciousness, and it's the main one that we're trying to develop in our practice, is what we call yogic direct perception, is when we have a union of mental quiescence, calm abiding, and special insight, or penetrative insight, it was called on the slide earlier. Those two observing in particular emptiness, selflessness. And when that becomes non-conceptual, it becomes a yogic direct perceiver. So even Geshe, this was Geshe Tenzin Temple in his commentary, someone asked, well, is meditative stabilization present when we have the yogic direct perception going on? And of course you have to say that it's there, or you wouldn't be able to be in that meditative state that's a union of calm abiding and special insight. But you're no longer observing an imputed object at that point, because you're seeing emptiness directly. They say it's like water poured into water. So the idea here is that this is maybe not an absolute complete definition, but it's meant to exclude the ordinary objects of our sense consciousnesses. So when you are staring at a candle, to increase your concentration or something, you're technically not working on your meditative stabilization. You are maintaining an attention. We talked about that mental factor and trying to extend the attention that you have to that object. You have to, they say, work with an imputed object to actually develop your meditative stabilization. Yeah, Bob. Yeah. Yeah. Mm. Yeah. I don't know. Bob was just wondering if that's perhaps why we frequently call that period of direct perception of emptiness meditative equipoise, as opposed to samadhi or meditative stabilization. And it's not to deny that it's there. It was interesting. One of the things that I remembered coming across was this book. Some of you have seen this before, Path to the Middle. It's a wonderful oral commentary on the beginning of the 6th chapter of Chandrakirti's text, Madhyamakavattara. And Khensur Yeshe Tupten is the author for this. And he actually says, with respect, he says here, there's a phrase, whatever is conscious of meditative equipoise on emptiness directly cognizes emptiness. That phrase means that whatever is one entity with that mind, for example, virtuous factors, we are going to go to those next after we finish the 5 object determining, faith, conscientiousness, and so forth. All of these is also said to directly cognize emptiness. So when we say that the main mind is cognizing emptiness, you have that meditative equipoise that is focused single-pointedly on emptiness, and it's appearing directly to the mind. As I mentioned before, it's like water poured into water. There's no differentiation of subjective awareness, object being known. It's a pure experience of those two kind of united. We can say that everything that is present in that mind is also realizing emptiness, all the mental factors that are concomitant with it. So he goes on to say, specifically, what directly cognizes emptiness is the main mind and 23 of the 51 mental factors. And he delineates the 23. All of these being associated with a main consciousness that directly cognizes emptiness, which makes them cognizers of emptiness as well. And these include the 5 omnipresent, of course, because they're present all the time. The 5 determining mental factors. So we have to say, again, meditative stabilization has got to be there, because even though it's no longer an imputed object, it is present in the mind at that point. All 11 virtuous mental factors are there. So we're up to 21 now. And the 2 changeable mental factors that are going to be at the very end of our text, investigation and analysis. So it's kind of interesting, that he actually delineates, which ones can we say are there in that state of mind. Pardon? Downright adorable. It's like who's all there, at that moment in time, you know. So anyway, I thought that I'd point that out. We are going to see a little bit more on this as we go through this section on meditative stabilization. That wasn't the only reference to this idea of it being an imputed object. Let me just finish this little bit that starts there at the bottom. It says, just as it has been said above, it is a one-pointedness of mind that within observing an imputed thing is continuously set upon it, maintaining that continuity of single-pointed awareness with mindfulness, holding it there. Again, this is why the two really work in tandem: mindfulness and concentration, and then introspection is that level of mind checking the mindfulness. Yeah, Bob. Mm-hmm. Right. Right, and that was why I was going kind of. So Bob's just bringing up the point. But the one term you use, you said it can't be a cognition. Well, cognition is the larger bucket of everything. Valid cognition versus it can't be a conceptual awareness any longer at that point. When we're directly realizing emptiness, conceptuality, again, we talked previously about how all of conceptuality works with this mental image or imputed object, whatever you want to call it. The idea is we're holding something to mind that isn't the actual object in reality. When we realize emptiness directly, that falls away, and emptiness and the mind knowing emptiness, as I said, kind of merge. And so you no longer have an imputed thing appearing to the mind. But we have to say that you still have meditative stabilization present, simply because that's the basis for you getting there. That's going to carry over into that experience. Right. And that's why, yeah. Well, let's hold on to that. And so, yeah, you're bringing up the point that then it is contradictory, and it is contradictory to a degree, but it's simply a caveat that once you get to that level, then we won't have an imputed thing present. And all of these really are being presented as conceptual based because that's where we are now. When we get to the direct perception, we can say that they still will be there, but they aren't going to any longer be conceptual based. They're going to be a different kind of a transmutation of that, if you will. So we're studying them. I think we're making generalizations, but it's on the basis of where we're at and what we have to practice, is to recognize that all of these are conceptual minds that we need to formulate. Because even if you talk about faith or some of the virtuous mental factors, and Geshe Yeshe Topten, as I mentioned, says all 11 of those are present when you're directly realizing emptiness. So how does faith realize emptiness? How does, when faith is, as we're going to see, a different conceptual framework? All of them are kind of conceptual frameworks. So at some level, you've transcended their ordinary way of operating and kind of developed a different type of awareness. I was going to I think I don't know if I have any passages from that, but if we'll go through the slides and that, and then when we'll come back to this topic, I'll read a little bit from what Geshe Tenzin Temple says about that in response to that question. Because he can say, to some degree, we can say that the definition is not completely accurate then, and doesn't fault it in any way. It just means that, once more, it's a presentation on the basis of what we need to do with our crazy conceptual minds to practice this stuff. When we get to that level of higher realization, there is a different quality to those minds. So let's just read this last little bit and then I will go to the slides. The objective feature of meditative stabilization, on top of page 30, is specified to be an imputed thing, because when cultivating meditative stabilization, one holds the mind to an object of observation that is imputed by the mind. So I'm going to stop there. We're going to come to these different categories of objects of observation. Let's go to our slides and do our share screen. Getting more proficient at this, I hope, through mindfulness. Um, so we go on to Geshe Rapton's way of talking about this first. He uses the term concentration. Sometimes, again, it's called concentration or single-pointed concentration or simply stabilization, is a distinct mental factor that is capable of dwelling one-pointedly, bearing the same aspect for a sustained duration of time upon a single referent. So, I mean, we can say that I suppose you have, it's hard to have kind of an awareness of an object with some level of mindfulness if you aren't keeping it in your with some continuity. So we can say that that concentration isn't going to be there in these momentary experiences, but is going to be there when we are actually staying with an object, thinking about an object, whether that object be something we're trying to practice and study, like developing, loving kindness or what have you, or whether it's something that is a delusion in the mind that we're staying with and ruminating over, as I was mentioning earlier. So he gives a little more delineation to the function. It has the function of acting as the basis for the increase of intelligence. Intelligence or wisdom is the next mental factor that we're going to be looking at, the final of these five. And then bringing all mundane and supramundane phenomena under control. So this is an additional component. We did see this idea that it acts as a basis for knowledge or for wisdom, intelligence earlier, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. I'm not going to get into that in huge detail right now, but this idea of the second part of that, item B on the slide, bringing all mundane and supramundane phenomena under control. I don't know that I can comment on it. It's just an interesting phrase. It sort of really does speak to the role that concentration plays in terms of our ability to comprehend and come to know uh, mundane, meaning worldly phenomena, as well as what is supramundane, which is what transcends our conventionalities and what have you, which would be, wisdom of emptiness and all of that. So this is how we're bringing that under control, is through the force of concentration, through our meditative stabilization. He continues on in his text saying, concentration exists to some degree in the minds of us all. At present, this faculty may be undeveloped and only able to remain on one object for a very limited duration. Admittedly, this is where we all start, is with minds that don't have very good duration of concentration. Those 9 mental abidings, the very first stage is where we are more off of the object than we are on the object. So that's comforting to know that that's where it starts, is that we just build up our concentration gradually, and we all are going to be somewhat deficient in our concentration when we do our meditative practice until we've sustained it for longer periods. And it says, but with continuous effort and practice, its ability to dwell one-pointedly upon a single object can be developed until, in a state of total mental quiescence, again, this is this shamatha, or calm abiding. This is a demarcation of a particular level that is after these 9 mental abidings that you attain, but it also can refer to everything above it, all the concentrations and so on, because they are all a form of mental quiescence. But once you're in this state of total mental quiescence, you can remain for days concentrating on a particular object. As I mentioned, when you have a fully qualified calm abiding or mental quiescence, you develop what's called pliancy. And there, in our presentation, we're going to be talking about it mainly as pliancy of the mind, meaning a serviceability of the mind, but the body also becomes serviceable, so that you can actually stay in meditative concentration as long as you want without your legs falling asleep and your back hurting and whatever the case might be. So it's kind of interesting to think about, and can be very inspiring in wanting to develop that level of meditative concentration. But Venerable George mentioned something about Alan Wallace and his commentary, saying that Alan Wallace and he, I think it was Geshe Rabton that they learned from, and he was very inspired by Alan Wallace, because Alan Wallace made this determination that he really wanted to get meditative stabilization, to get calm abiding, because he wanted to realize bodhicitta in this life. Because of course you can't have spontaneous, uncontrived bodhicitta without calm abiding, or what we studied in the master's program was you could have possibly some people, maybe they could develop it at the 8th mental abiding. And then, of course, the ninth would also be included. But for most people, we need to have a fully qualified calm abiding or mental quiescence, that level of meditative stabilization, to have bodhicitta. So you cannot, become a bodhisattva, get your little bodhisattva card and carry it with you in your wallet, I'm a bodhisattva, whatever. You can't have that qualification, that title, that level of even ability to practice until you have calm abiding. So it's something very important to developing realizations and proceeding on the path. So once you attain that state, as it says here, you can remain for days concentrating on a particular object. Of course, by that time, because this is a virtuous practice, you're not going to be meditating on anger and what that person said that annoyed you. If anything, you'll be, of course, looking at them with compassion and generating even greater qualities on the basis of things that would normally disturb the mind. And then it goes on, the next slide. Furthermore, beings who have taken birth in one of the formless realms can spend eons absorbed in concentration on extremely subtle objects, such as the infinity of space and the infinity of consciousness. Remember, I mentioned these four formless absorptions that follow from the four concentrations are infinite space, infinite consciousness, nothingness, and then without discrimination, not without discrimination, or the peak of psychic existence, as it's called in when it's a realm. But when you become a formless being, when you exit from an embodied state with that level of awareness, and you have that unmoving karma that takes you into one of these formless existences, you just remain absorbed in concentration on extremely subtle objects like that until that karma wears out, and then once more you fall from that. Go into another realm of existence. Concentration is also an important factor in the heightening of intelligence. This is what was mentioned, so I'm going to talk about that a little bit more now. Again, that this is the factor that increases our wisdom, our knowledge, our intelligence. When we are taking a photograph, the steadier we hold the camera, the sharper will be the picture. Similarly, the firmer and more intense our concentration becomes, the sharper and more acute our intelligence becomes. So this is one analogy, is like if you have a camera, the steadier that you're holding it, the sharper and clearer the picture will be, right? And many of us know that from experience, right? And especially nowadays with the phones and everything, you get smaller things to hold perhaps, but I don't know. If you've got a camera and you're holding it really steady, then you can get a clear picture. The analogy that's sometimes used I think in Lama Tsongkhapa's Lamrim Chenmo, he uses the analogy of if you were in a very dark cave and there were paintings on the wall, and you had light to be able to illuminate what you were seeing, you'd need to have a very steady flame or steady light in order to see all of what's on the wall. And this is another way of looking at it, is that the steadier, the more stable your light source is, the clearer everything that's going to appear to you. If you have a flickering candle, you're only going to catch glimpses of it and you're never going to get the full picture. So this is the way these two work in tandem. That's why we always talk about, again, a union of calm abiding and special insight, that when we have that stability of concentration, then we have the ability to see things clearly, to discern things through our intelligence. All right. Oh, this is getting into objects of observation. Let's stop the share there and go back to the text. In the text on page 30, we have the next sentence. It says, furthermore, although there appear to be many enumerations of objects of observation for meditative stabilization, when condensed, it is taught that there are 4 categories. The first one is called objects of observation for purifying behavior, the next for purifying afflictions, then what are called pervasive, or sometimes the term is used, universal objects of observation, and then finally objects of observation for developing skill, for increasing our skill, or again, and this is going to be the one that's perhaps most related to developing intelligence or knowledge. And then it goes on to say, also the object of observation for developing skill are taught to be of infinite types, this last one, because we have a lot of things that we can meditate on to degenerate and deepen our skill with regard to understanding those objects, knowing those objects, increasing our intelligence and wisdom in regard to those objects. Observation of the 5 aggregates, observation of the 18 constituents, observation of the 12 sources, observation of the 12 links of dependent arising, and so forth. So We're going to go to the slides now again and take a look at these. These are just a repeat of what you just had on your page, so I don't need to say much more about that. We're going to look at what is said in this wonderful book. This actually is a later edition of the book that was originally called Walking Through Walls, I think was the name of it. It's by Geshe Gedon Lodro. Calm Abiding and Special Insight is the name of this republished edition of this. Jeffrey Hopkins did the translation and edited it. But this is, by the way, you will find this whole presentation of these 4 objects in Lama Tsongkhapa's Lamrim Chenmo. But the explanation there was a bit lengthier, and so there's a nice introduction to these at the very beginning of this. So I thought I would use that. If you're interested in the Lamrim Chenmo in particular and where those are, I think it's around page 35. 35, they start a general presentation of objects of meditation. And of course, there's the commentary from Geshe Sopa, if you are interested in seeing what he has to say about that. And I'm not going to go through everything that is talked about at that level. I just want to give you an introduction to these so that you have some idea of what these various objects of observation are. The first one, objects of observation for purifying behavior, are used by persons in whom one of the afflictive emotions predominates and are named for their ability temporarily to pacify afflictive emotions. So say that your particular, your bugaboo, your one affliction that really is driving you crazy is, well, let's use anger because it's the common one that many people deal with in our culture, right? And so this may be a pattern that comes up for you frequently. So your object of observation would be to work with trying to diminish the strength of your anger through applying the antidotes to anger that are what we call our temporal antidotes. The things that suppress anger, that don't allow it to be there. They're not going to get rid of your anger, but they're going to keep it from manifesting. For example, to think about how that person is under the control of the afflictions and therefore is an object of compassion and not an object of anger. To think about how you created the karma to have that person who's annoying you and making things challenging for you in your life, so that therefore you don't feel the sense of wanting to blame them for everything and make them the object of why that's happening. So the idea here is that you apply these various antidotes. Of course, the main one is for anger is loving kindness towards that person, which is of course rooted in this understanding that they're under the control of their delusions and so on. Because in the face of love, hatred can't arise. When we are loving someone, genuinely wanting them to be happy, there's no way that we can wish ill will upon them. These two are contrary states of mind. So that's the first one, is when we are talking about purifying behavior. You might wonder, well, behavior is a pretty wide category here. It's not just saying what we say or do, but it's also delineating a particular afflictive emotion that is problematic for us. The second type, and I had to change the number here, because they've got a different order they're presented in Geshe Gedon Lodro's text, but the second type of object of observation is for purifying afflictive emotions. What are posited here as afflictive emotions? They are afflictive emotions included within either the desire realm or the 2 upper realms, which are the form realm and the formless realm. So this is more akin to, and we're going to see this in the next slide, this is where we are not just working with purifying one affliction. So say in the first one we saw, it's because we're dealing with anger that we then feel we need to have an object of observation that helps us to diminish our anger. Here the idea is we're going to actually choose a broader way of diminishing our afflictions by focusing on the afflictions of the desire realm as something we want to separate from. And that's what you do when you move from calm abiding into the first concentration. And then throughout the form and the formless realm, you try to separate from the levels of afflictions that are together with each of those. At the first concentration, there is an attachment to being in the first concentration and delusions that arise in that. And you diminish those by going to the second concentration. And you look at the second concentration as coarse and move then to the third concentration and separate yourself from the level of afflictions that pertain to the second concentration, and so on. So you do this through a process that are called the 7 preparations. So Geshe Gedon Lodro continues in the next slide. He says, in dependence on the 7 preparations for each of the concentrations the 4 concentrations and the 4 formless absorptions, one separates from the afflictive emotions of desire and so forth, pertaining to the level below the concentration or the formless absorption that one is trying to attain. So again, I've talked about this previously, so I don't want to, go into it in that much detail, but this is the process that you go through after you attain calm abiding. Calm abiding is already said to be a form realm mind, but you haven't technically done the work to begin uh, cultivating one of the form realm concentrations. These 4 concentrations, one, first, second, third, and fourth, that's the label they give them at that, those 4 concentrations of the form realm. To get to the first level, as I mentioned, you have to separate from your desire, attachment, the other afflictions of the desire realm. So you do that by seeing all of that as being coarse, gross, and the subtlety, the pacification that occurs when you attain the first concentration. And you do it through this analysis. There's analysis that's involved in some of these preparations that help you to advance to finally getting a fully qualified first concentration, where you have now a new level of meditative stabilization, a new level of samadhi that has, in a sense, separated from the afflictions of the desire realm, but not in a permanent way. If you've done it in this more mundane way of looking at it, you can do this through special insight as well that is focused on the wisdom of emptiness. But it's said that most people, again, develop it in a more mundane way. And so what you're doing is you're kind of keeping any afflictions of the desire realm from arising by maintaining a first concentration mind. And then when you go to the second concentration, you see the first concentration as coarse, and then you see the peacefulness that exists in the second concentration. When you develop the second concentration, you've separated from, temporarily, all of the afflictions of the first concentration, as well as the desire realm. And so it builds in that way. But as I mentioned previously, what's beyond the 4 concentrations are the 4 formless absorptions, and you can get to the top of those, this level that's called without discrimination, not without discrimination, meaning there's still very subtle discrimination there, but it's an extremely subtle mind. You can't ever separate from your attachment to that state until you generate the wisdom realizing emptiness and begin to remove that in a more permanent way, a lasting way. Okay, so this is what's being talked about here, is that this is the ability that we have in this second type to separate from, purify afflictions in a much broader way. So we get rid of the afflictions that are pertaining to the desire realm by generating the first concentration. We get rid of those pertaining to the first concentration by developing the second concentration. Does everybody kind of get this idea? I mean, it's way beyond what any of us have practiced, I assume. I mean, I'm just speaking from my own experience, not even having, calm abiding. So this is something that we can kind of understand intellectually, but experientially. Of course, all the teachers said that we've experienced these countless times, many lifetimes. We've known these. We've been in every realm of existence countless times. So it means we've developed form realm concentrations and formless realm absorptions and so on. So this is just pointing out there's this difference then between the first 2 that we looked at, those that purify behavior and those that purify afflictive emotions. Objects of observation that purify behavior are for the sake of pacifying a specific afflictive emotion that is predominant, whether it be desire is the equivalent they're using here for attachment, hatred, obscuration is their equivalent here for ignorance, pride, discursiveness. And the second type of object of observation for purifying afflictive emotions purifies all afflictive emotions of a particular level equally. So it's not where you're targeting one and saying, I'm trying to counteract my anger through meditating on an antidote to that, but rather I'm going to pacify all of the afflictions of the desire realm by seeing their coarseness and so on. All right. So the final slide on this, thus, in dependence on one of the preparations for a concentration or on an actual concentration, a meditator achieves a state of having separated from all afflictive emotions pertaining to the desire realm or to a particular concentration or a formless absorption. So again, depending on where you're at in this process. So obviously these are not objects of observation that we're going to have right from the get-go, because we don't have the ability to be moving from calm abiding to these various realms, moving out of the desire realm level of afflictions to the first concentration. So these objects of observation are not something that, again, you're going to have right at the beginning. They're an object of observation for somebody who has already developed shamatha, calm abiding. At least that's my interpretation of this. I haven't, again, seen that in any of these, but it wouldn't make sense that you would have these as objects of observation until you get to that level, because there's no point in kind of thinking of the first concentration as being peaceful and the desire realm as being coarse until you can generate the first concentration, and you need calm abiding prior to doing that. The third category, which is we called pervasive, as I mentioned, some texts call this universal. This refers to the fact that this type pervades all objects of observation. You might wonder, well, why is that one of the four categories? It's just essentially saying that, everything is included in this. We can find specifically within these pervasive objects of observation particular things that we might want to focus on. I'm not sure why it's included as a separate category, just to say that, again, we can include everything in this to some degree. Objects of observation for developing skill, the fourth one, are perhaps one of the most important ones, because these have the feature that by training in them, one becomes skilled. We develop expertise. This fourth category includes objects of observation, such as the Four Noble Truths, which is why I mentioned them in the motivation tonight. So we've all heard them before, I'm sure, but just to remind us all. The 12 link dependent arising is the terminology they use in this text. I'll show the 12 links on a screen shortly. If one studies the texts on these subjects, one becomes skilled in them. So it's not just the studying, but it's the meditating on them. Again, objects of observation that we want to meditate on to develop our skill in them. So again, while we're talking about developing meditative stabilization, as I said before, it's important whether we're doing stabilizing meditation, that is just focusing on a single object, or if we're doing analytical meditation. You might think that they're opposed to each other, but as I've pointed out previously, we bring those two minds together in this union of calm abiding and special insight. So even to develop some ability to analyze things, such as the Four Noble Truths, such as the 12 links, requires meditative stabilization. We can't, can't emphasize that too much. The two do work in tandem. The instruction I usually give to beginning students in meditation is to try to do those in your own practice. When you initially might start with some form of stabilizing meditation, but say then you introduce a Lam Rim topic. Say you're meditating on perfect human rebirth and trying to appreciate the incredible value of this life that you have. Well, then when you get to a place where you feel like, okay, I'm kind of getting it, there's a bit of an epiphany, if you will, maybe not that strong, but something that you feel, you've got some feeling for that preciousness of this life, then you focus single-pointedly on that so that you induce meditative stabilization once more to help you to deepen your skill and awareness of that particular Lam Rim topic. So this is a way, again, that we see that it doesn't become completely discursive. At times, our meditation can be discursive because we're thinking about various reasonings and what have you. But nonetheless, we're trying to drive home to stabilize ourselves continually on these various objects that we're trying to understand. So the categories that are mentioned in that paragraph that we just read, there's a bunch of things. We've all seen the 5 aggregates before, right? Because I had this slide previously. I'm just repeating it. Form, feeling, discrimination, compositional factors, and consciousness. These are said to encompass all impermanent or conditioned phenomena. Everything that exists that is conditioned, that arises from causes and conditions, can be included somewhere in this if we talk about it in a general way. Usually we talk about the 5 aggregates, though, as being the basis for a person. So in that way, you have your own little private form and your own little private feeling and private discrimination and so on. These are all part of your continuum. And so that's how the 5 aggregates are frequently referred to. But nonetheless, they can be generalized. And we can say that everything that is produced, that is caused, is in this. So there is this one category of impermanent phenomena called non-associated compositional factors, meaning that you can't associate them with either form or consciousness, which are as I mentioned previously, if we divide the five aggregates, the first one is form, matter, and then the other four are all in the realm of consciousness. But that's not true in the largest way. That may be true for a person, but in regard to the largest way we look at phenomena, things like time is impermanent, right? It's constantly changing. That would be included in compositional factors because that's a non-associated compositional factor. So anything you can think of that is caused, that is conditioned, fits somewhere into these five. Everything that's physical obviously is in form. Everything that is mental is somewhere in the remaining four. But even those things that are like time, I'm trying to think of some of the other ones. There's a whole list of them. Jeffrey Hopkins, I didn't bring my copy of Meditation on Emptiness. He brought in yeah, person is actually a non-associated compositional factor because you can't say the person is form or the person is consciousness. Yeah, yeah, Rachel. Mm-hmm. Are obviously there, but then the other right. 9 are also within. Exactly. Yeah, Rachel was pointing out that yeah, the of the 51 that we are discussing in this course, 2 are the second and third on the list, feeling and discrimination, and then the remaining 49 are in compositional factors. So they are included in there. And when we talk about the basis for a person, that would be, I think, pretty much the bulk of what's included in there. It's weird to think even that person is included in there because then the person would seem to be among the aggregates, but the person isn't really. I mean, that when we talk about them in regard to the basis for a person, they're just simply the mental components that these other mental factors. But anyway, this is one categorization, and if you want to study them in more detail, this as well as the next few slides, you can study Abhidharma Kosha and get your fill of them. So definitely discussed at length there. The 18 constituents was mentioned. These encompass all phenomena. So in other words, we've gone now, the very first one was just conditioned phenomena. Now we're talking about all phenomena. Everything that exists is encompassed in this in 3 groups of 6 each that do line up. And I just didn't put these in a chart format. But essentially you have the 6 objects, which are visible forms. That includes, shape and color, everything that appears to the eye, sounds that appear to the ear, odors that appear to the nose, tastes that appear to the tongue, tangible objects that appear to the body, and then phenomena, which includes everything that the mental consciousness can know, through which is everything essentially, because the mental consciousness has the potential or the ability to know all phenomena. Then you have the 6 sense powers that are correlated with those. We've talked about these extensively before, right? This came up in contact, as well as previously we talked about them as part of what has to occur for a consciousness to arise, that there has to be a sense power through which it is empowered to know particular objects. And the ones for the 5 senses are quite unique to their objects. So it's through the eye sense power that we know visible forms, which was the object in the first set of 6. It's through the ear sense power that we are able to access sounds. And it's through the nose that we know odors and so on. So those 5 are the physical ones. And then the mental sense power. What's the mental sense power again? You guys have been really good on this one. the previous moment of of consciousness, not mental, the previous moment of consciousness. So then you have the 6 consciousnesses that are arising in relation to the sense power and the object that is being known. So you have the eye consciousness that is empowered by the eye sense power that is knowing visible forms. The ear consciousness that is empowered by the ear sense power that knows sounds, and so on. And then you get to the final one, the mental consciousness, which is empowered by our mental sense power, which is the previous moment of consciousness, to know phenomena. So that's just one way of looking at everything that exists, is we're going to split it into these 3 categories on the basis of the objects that are known, the sense power that facilitates their knowing, and the consciousnesses that actually know them. Then we have the division into the 12 sources. This was mentioned as well, observation of the 12 sources. This is where we're going to condense and really only use, if we go back to the previous slide, we see that we're only going to use 2 of these categories. You see how like the 3rd category just disappears when I go to the next slide. It's kind of cool, huh? So there's two groups of six. So you might wonder, well, how can this include everything if I've gotten rid of the whole category of six consciousnesses? Where would the six consciousnesses be included? The object of the mental consciousness phenomena. I think you could include them there. Traditionally, all the teachers seem to point to, well, the mental sense power always includes the previous moment of consciousness, and everything is always followed by a moment of consciousness. So you always have that, that's encompassed in there, because every moment of consciousness that arises is a mental sense power for the following moment of consciousness. So in that way, we could say that they're all included within that. But I agree with you. Phenomena, through our mental consciousness, we can know all phenomena, which includes, you can have a clairvoyance knowing others' minds. You can eventually develop the omniscient mind of a Buddha that is a fully developed consciousness that can know all moments of mind, because that's the all phenomena. But yeah, Bob. Yeah, Bob's bringing up the point where when you call them 12 sources, or what are they a source of? But sometimes they're called the 12 spheres, so it's not that it's absolute in terms of how it's translated, but I think you can say there might be that meaning that it's the source of consciousness. This is just a way of delineating these other two factors, these two sets of six that are the objects and the sense powers, which you can say, yeah, are the basis for any particular moment of consciousness. Is that a consciousness isn't without, it's a subjective component without, you can't have it without an objective component, and you can't have it without a doorway through that through which that object is known. Yeah, Rachel.
Is it ever talked about the 18 constituents, 12 sources, and the six consciousnesses? Is that ever a way?
Is that a Rachel was asking if it's ever presented to say that the 18 constituents are the 12 sources plus the six consciousnesses. I'm trying to recall from my studies if that's actually the way it was presented. I'm not sure it was, but I mean, you can. I mean, I don't think there's any fault in saying that. I don't know. I'd have to go back and look at Vasubandhu's text. Yeah.
Describes those two that are the same as, is it identified as the same as this first 6 plus 6 in this 18?
Well, so Rachel's question is identified as the same. If you said these 12 that we have in front of us on the slide, are they identical to what we have in the previous slide when we go back to the 18 constituents? Well, in a sense, we can say that's so, because once more, every moment of consciousness is included in the mental sense power. As again is traditionally pointed out, though we can also say they're included in phenomena. But if you want to get down to it, just the word phenomena includes everything at some level. So there's not a lot of point in kind of breaking down any of this other, except that it's about understanding, looking at the constituents and the sources is about understanding the processes that are involved in consciousness being developed to some degree, or in how we can categorize things as subjective awarenesses versus objective things that are known, and then again this medium through which we are knowing things. I don't know. I'm not sure that when they talk about these things, my recollection of when I studied Vasubandhu's text was that there wasn't that level of exposition about why it's that way. These are just, Vasubandhu's text is very encyclopedic, and it just kind of says, okay, and these are the this, and this is the that, and da, da, da. And you don't really get this kind of answer to these sorts of questions. But I'll investigate them and see what I can find out. Again, our meditation on them is just so we can begin to have an awareness of reality at the conventional level in terms of understanding the way that things are categorized and known. And in that way, I don't know that it's going to lead to any supreme realizations or what have you, but yeah, Rachel. Exactly. Yeah. How do we, yeah. Well, I guess we can, Rachel was bringing up that frequently we say that, like going back to the very first of these objects of observation, if pride is your affliction that is predominant, they say that what you should meditate on is all these various categorizations of phenomena, such as the 18 constituents and so on, as a way of diminishing your pride. I guess it is helpful to like look at this and see how much we don't know, how much is not an object of knowledge for us, because there's extensive stuff included in so many of these categories. I don't know. I have to admit that that was probably my least favorite text of the master's program when we studied Abhidharma Kosha. I got into it okay in parts, but a lot of parts of it were just really obtuse. It's like, yeah, I don't know. Anyway, I can't claim to be an expert on that text at all. Okay, so we went through the first three, 5 aggregates, 18 constituents, 12 sources. Just so you know, the 12 links of dependent arising, in case you haven't encountered them before, I think all of you have some exposure to them. This was a presentation, the main sutra that these derive from is the Rice Seedling Sutra, where the Buddha delineated that from ignorance comes compositional action, from compositional action comes consciousness, from consciousness comes name and form, and so on. This is this process that shows how we take rebirth and cyclic existence again and again. It's not meant to explain the entire composition of everything that the Buddha taught in terms of phenomenology and what have you. It's specifically to help us to understand dependent arising in regard to our existences and how we are creating the causes for future existences, and how a particular cause plays out in terms of a particular existence that we have. And when that existence comes to an end, how we then are subject to the wheel of life and continuing to go on to other existences. So it has a very specific purpose, and it's said to be meditated on primarily by solitary realizers. Remember, we have hearers and solitary realizers as the two practitioners of the Hinayana path, the path that leads to individual liberation. It's the solitary realizers that seem to develop a real acuity for looking at this particular teaching. But yeah, Bob. Yeah, on number 5 there. Yeah, there once more our 6 sources appear, those 6 sense powers. I'm not going to go into a full explanation of these. If you have a desire to even have like a brief exposure to them, His Holiness's book called The Meaning of Life is a really nice one to get a good feeling for them. But they're presented in almost every Lam Rim text again in the section of the middle scope, when usually at the end of that, after the suffering and the causes of suffering have been talked about, they usually go into the 12 links. It's a very difficult teaching in many ways, but very, very useful, to reflect on. Gives us a real feeling for how we can break this cycle. Wow, it's 8:17. How did the time go by so quickly? Okay, so let's pause, let's stop our share. Let's see if there's any questions. Any questions from online folks? Sorry, I didn't get further than that. God, we get into this talking about 5 this and 6 that, and the time goes by so quickly. You have lots of things you can talk about at your next social gathering, right? Quiz people at your... So maybe our pride has been diminished by being here. Mine certainly has. I wish I was had more expertise on some of these. Let's go ahead and do our dedication prayers, and if there's no questions, conclude for tonight. Page 235 in the prayer books here. So maybe just generate a few thoughts before we recite these prayers, thinking about this past, hour and a half that we've been here, looking at this topic of primarily meditative stabilization, mindfulness. It might seem like it's not quite so related to this idea of becoming enlightened, but it's absolutely essential for us to understand these factors, to cultivate these factors at a deeper level in our own minds. So we dedicate now for us to be able to do that fully, to be able to develop our minds completely into the state of Buddhahood, and then to bring all sentient beings to accomplishing that same achievement. And then we recite the second verse, which helps us to recollect that we need bodhicitta. We need it to be cultivated very deeply in our own hearts in order to accomplish this path. So we make strong prayers that that happen for ourselves and for others, and that all the causes of that happen, as we mentioned tonight, for us to be able to generate perfect concentration that will help us to have spontaneous bodhicitta, to be able to become a bodhisattva and practice the path to enlightenment. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish but increase more and more. Page 244, we'll do the two prayers there, the brief prayers for His Holiness, His long life, as well as Lama Zopa. As we recite these verses, think that we're creating the causes for all our spiritual guides to have good health and long lives. In the land encircled by snow mountains, you are the source of all happiness and good. All-powerful Chenrezig, Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. You who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers, honoring the three jewels, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. And then finally, as usual, dedicate for anyone that you're holding in your heart right now. You can think about people in the world in general, as well as those who we know who are experiencing obstacles, illness, who are dying or who have died, and dedicate very strongly for their welfare, that they may be free of their suffering and find all the causes for true peace and happiness. And while it starts with those specific individuals or groups that we are holding in our hearts, we also dedicate that all beings may find perfect peace and happiness through what we've done here tonight. Okay, thank you all very much. See you next week. Thank you all online.